She spent 25 years making herself invisible, and still, they found ways to make her feel smaller. The day Hazel Mercer carried her finest quilt into town, the women of Red Hollow didn't just mock her work. They laughed while she bled in the dirt. But one stranger stopped. One man picked up what everyone else had trampled. And from that single, unremarkable moment, a town's cruelty, a woman's grief, and a love neither of them asked for, everything in Red Hollow was about to change. If you've ever felt like the broken piece no one wanted, stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Hazel Mercer decided to bring her quilt to the Red Hollow sewing circle, she told herself it didn't matter what they thought. She had been telling herself that for most of her life. She woke before the sun had any real color to it, when the sky was still that uncertain gray that couldn't decide whether to stay night or turn into something else. The ranch was cold. It was always cold in the mornings, even in late spring, when the wind came down from the northern ridgeline and found every gap in the walls that her father had never gotten around to patching. Hazel had patched most of them herself, eventually. That was how most things worked at the Mercer place. You waited for someone to fix something, and then you realized no one was coming, and then you fixed it yourself. She dressed without lighting the lamp. She knew the room well enough by feel. The low beam over the washstand that she'd cracked her forehead on a dozen times before learning to duck. The loose floorboard near the window that sang out in the cold. The chair where she draped tomorrow's clothes every night so that mornings could move faster. Small disciplines. Small economies of time and energy. The habits of a woman who lived alone and had stopped expecting the day to be anything other than what she made it. The quilt was folded on the table. She'd been working on it for 6 weeks. Longer than that, really. She'd been collecting the fabric for almost a year, pulling pieces from worn-out shirts and old curtains, and a dress she'd had at 17 that had long since given out at the seams, but that she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away. There was a square cut from her mother's apron, faded to the color of old butter, the cotton so soft from decades of washing that it almost felt like something alive. There were pieces of indigo from a bolt of cloth a trader had sold off cheaply 2 winters ago, colors so deep they looked like bruises in low light and like evening sky and bright sun. There was brown canvas and cream linen and a strip of red wool from a blanket that had kept Hazel warm during the bad winter 4 years back, when the pipes froze and the woodpile ran short, and she'd slept in her coat for 3 weeks straight. None of those pieces had started beautiful. That was what Hazel understood about cloth that most people didn't. It was the history in the fabric that gave it worth, not the newness. You couldn't get that quality in a dry goods store. You had to earn it. She ran her hand over the top once, checking the stitchwork the way a person checks a door lock before leaving the house. Not because she doubted herself, but because caring about something meant attending to it right up until the moment you let it go. The binding was straight. The squares were even. The colors had come together in a way that surprised even her. She'd had no particular plan when she started, just a feeling about which pieces belonged near which others. And somewhere in the making, the thing had developed its own logic. The center was warm, yellows and golds and the soft apricot of her mother's apron. Moving outward, the colors deepened, rusts and burgundies and that dark indigo, until the border ran in a clean, strong navy that held everything else inside it. It looked, she thought, like a day going from morning into night, like something with a shape to it. She folded it carefully into the canvas bag she used for carrying fabric, wrapped the top closed, and went out to hitch the wagon. But Red Hollow was not a large town, but it was an organized one, which meant, in practical terms, that the same 15 or 20 people ran most of what happened there, and the rest of the population arranged themselves around those people like furniture around a fireplace. You faced the warmth if you wanted to be comfortable, and you kept your distance if you didn't mind the cold. Hazel had grown up on the outside edge of that arrangement. Her father, Thomas Mercer, had been a quiet man, not unfriendly, just self-contained in the way that some men were, more comfortable with animals and fence lines than with the social machinery of a small town. He'd run a fair ranch and kept to himself, and Red Hollow had more or less tolerated him the way you tolerate a neighbor who never bothers you but never quite feels like yours either. When he died 5 years ago, leaving Hazel the land and the debts and the work, the town's position on the Mercer Ranch had quietly calcified into something less neutral. A woman alone was a problem that Red Hollow had no particular framework for. She wasn't a widow. There was no husband to mourn, no history of partnership to respect. She wasn't young enough to be interesting in the way a girl of marriageable age was interesting. She was just a woman, 25, with a ranch and no family and a disposition that didn't invite pity. The pity came anyway. It always did. And underneath the pity, something sharper. She'd heard herself described at various points as peculiar, as difficult, as plain. That last one had been delivered directly to her face when she was 17 by a woman whose daughter was getting married and who had apparently decided that Hazel's attendance at the celebration required some clarification of her place in the social order. You're a good girl, Hazel, but you know you're not what men look for. She'd meant it as kindness, probably. That was the worst part. The cruelty that came wrapped in concern was harder to argue with than the cruelty that didn't bother to hide. Hazel was not, by any objective measure, what Red Hollow would call a beauty. Her face was angular, with a strong jaw and deep-set eyes the color of creek water. Not unpleasant, but serious, the kind of face that seemed to be thinking about something even when it wasn't. Her hands were rough from outdoor work. She was taller than was considered proper in a woman, and built in a way that suggested more labor than leisure. She dressed functionally, because she had no one to dress for, and no time for the performance of femininity that the town expected from its women. What she did have, what she'd always had, was the work, the quilts and the mending and the quiet precision of her stitchwork. It was the one place where what she made was unambiguously good, where the quality of the output couldn't be argued with even by people who had decided not to like her. Or so she'd thought. The sewing circle met every second Thursday in the back room of the Mercantile, a space that smelled permanently of sawdust and dried beans and the particular perfume that Millicent Harper wore, something floral and heavy that arrived in the room several seconds before she did. There were usually 8 or 10 women, arranged in a loose circle with their needlework in their laps, and the official purpose of the gathering was the mending and crafting work that a frontier town always needed. Blankets for the poor, garments for families that had fallen on hard times, the practical business of keeping people warm and clothed. The unofficial purpose was something else entirely, and everyone knew it. Hazel had been coming to the circle for 2 years, invited initially by a woman named Clara Osgood, who had brought her mending to Hazel's door one afternoon and left with a repaired skirt and an invitation to the next meeting. Hazel had gone mostly because Clara had asked directly, and she hadn't known how to refuse without seeming rude, and she'd continued going because, despite everything, there was something in the rhythm of the work she found steadying. She sat at the outer edge of the group, spoke when spoken to, completed her portion of whatever project was at hand, and mostly tried not to draw attention. She did not succeed in this last part. She never quite managed not to draw attention. Millicent Harper, who was 53 and had run the social life of Red Hollow for approximately 30 of those years, had taken a dislike to Hazel that Hazel had never fully understood and had given up trying to. Millicent was a handsome woman, well-maintained with silver-streaked hair and the particular posture of someone who has always been considered important. She had opinions about everything and the social authority to make those opinions felt. And for reasons Hazel could only partially explain, the sight of Hazel sitting in that circle, working quietly, seemed to agitate Millicent in a way that had nothing to do with anything Hazel had actually done. She can't help herself, Clara had told Hazel once, by way of explanation. She needs everyone to be in their place, and she can't figure out where your place is. Neither can I, Hazel had said. Clara had laughed, but there'd been truth in it. She arrived at the circle that Thursday with the quilt folded in her canvas bag and an emotion she was trying not to name. Pride, maybe. But that felt like too big a word for what she had. Pride suggested confidence, and what Hazel had was more like the cautious satisfaction of someone who has completed a difficult thing and wants, just wants, to have that acknowledged. The room was already full when she pushed through the door. Clara looked up and smiled. Several other women nodded. Millicent, seated at the center of the arrangement in her usual chair, the one with arms, the one that was marginally more substantial than the others, let her gaze move over Hazel and return to her own work without any change of expression. "You're late," Millicent said. She didn't look up. "By about 3 minutes," Hazel said, setting her bag down and taking her usual chair. 3 minutes is 3 minutes. Hazel didn't answer. She had learned, through repetition, that answering Millicent's openers only extended them. The circle's current project was a series of blankets for a family whose house had burned in March. Simple work, utilitarian, squares of whatever fabric was available sewn into something warm and decent. Hazel pulled the first piece toward her and began working, listening to the conversation move around the room the way she always did. Town business. Weather. A baby born to one of the families on the north end. A traveler who'd passed through last week with an unusual wagon. After about 40 minutes, Clara leaned toward her and said quietly, "Did you bring it?" Hazel glanced up. "Bring what?" "The quilt you've been working on. You mentioned it last time." She had mentioned it, briefly, casually, in the course of a conversation about a different project entirely. Just a reference, I'm working on something at home that's giving me trouble with the border. She hadn't intended it as an invitation for scrutiny. But Clara was looking at her with genuine interest, and the mention of it had been heard by others, because two more women turned toward her with expectant expressions. "I did bring it," Hazel said. She shouldn't have. She knew, even as she reached for the bag, that she shouldn't have. The cautious part of her brain, the part that had been trained by years of experience to calculate risk in social situations the way a person calculates footing on ice, that part was already sending up signals. "Don't. Leave it in the bag. There's no good outcome here." But Clara was looking at her with real interest, and that was rare enough that it overrode the warning. She lifted the quilt from the bag and unfolded it across her lap. And for a moment, in the low light of that back room, it caught the afternoon sun coming through the narrow window, and the colors shifted and deepened the way they had when she first laid it out at home, and felt something in her chest loosen. There was a silence. Then Millicent said, "Well." The single syllable carried an entire editorial. Hazel looked up. Millicent was studying the quilt with the particular expression of someone preparing to be generous while delivering a verdict. "It's very ambitious," she said, "for what it is." "What does that mean?" Hazel asked. She hadn't meant to ask it. The words came out before the cautious part of her brain could catch them. "I only mean the scale. For a work quilt, it's certainly sizable." Millicent tilted her head. "The color choices are interesting. Bold." "I think it's beautiful," Clara said directly. Two or three other women leaned forward to look, and there was a murmur of genuine appreciation from some of them. And then there was the distinct sound of one of the women toward the back. Geraldine Foss, who Hazel had never liked and who had never liked her, making a small noise that was not quite laughter, but was close enough to carry the same meaning. "Those squares aren't even," Geraldine said. "They're perfectly even," Clara said sharply. "The second row from the left. Count them." Hazel looked down. The second row was not uneven, but Geraldine had said it with enough certainty that the room shifted, and two more women bent to examine the work with the energy of people who had been given permission to find fault. "I suppose it's the sort of thing that looks better from a distance," Millicent said, in the tone of someone offering consolation. The conversation moved on, or tried to, but something had shifted, and Hazel sat with the quilt in her lap and felt the familiar shape of it. The feeling of having brought something she cared about into a room where it was not safe. She folded the quilt carefully and put it back in the bag. She did not say anything else about it. She left the circle earlier than usual before the tea was served, which she knew would be noted and interpreted. She didn't care, or she tried not to care, which was a slightly different thing. Her jaw ached from being held still, and her hands felt wrong, like she'd been gripping something for too long without knowing it. The main street of Red Hollow was busy in the mid-afternoon. Wagons and horses, a cluster of men outside the saloon, a group of children running in the way that children run when they have no particular destination and all the time in the world. The sun had moved to the southwest, and the light was that particular autumn gold that made everything look slightly better than it was. Hazel was crossing toward where she'd tied the wagon when her foot caught. She never knew exactly what it was, a loose board on the walkway, or a gap in the planking, or just her own distraction. Her foot turned under her and she went down hard, one knee hitting the boardwalk and one hand going out to catch herself, and the canvas bag slipped from her shoulder and the quilt tumbled out. It unrolled as it fell, 3 feet of it spilling off the edge of the walkway and landing in the street, in the dust and the horse traffic and the thin mud from last night's rain. She heard the laughter before she could process what had happened. Not from everyone, she understood that later, but from enough people and loud enough that it filled the space. It was the particular laughter of a crowd that has been handed something, an event, a visible embarrassment, and can't quite resist it, even if some of them might prefer to. She was on her knees on the boardwalk, and her quilt was in the dirt, and people were laughing. She reached for the nearest corner of the fabric, moving fast, wanting only to get it out of the mud. And in her hurry, she knocked her knuckles hard against the boardwalk edge and felt the skin split. Small pain. She barely registered it. She was pulling the quilt toward her, trying to assess the damage, when she heard a different sound. Not laughter, just footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. A pair of boots appeared in her field of vision. Work boots, well worn, the leather cracked along the toe, but recently resoled. The boots stopped next to the trailing end of the quilt, and then the man crouched, not in a rush, not making a performance of it, just going down on one knee the way you would to look at something that deserved looking at. He picked up the quilt with both hands. The fabric moved across his palms, and he turned it slightly, and there was a brief pause. A real pause, not a polite one, where he was actually looking at it. Then he straightened and held it toward her. "Here," he said. Hazel looked up. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with the particular look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. Weathered skin, sun-dark, with lines around his eyes that weren't quite wrinkles yet but were heading that way. He had dark hair pushed back from his forehead and the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any intention toward it. His hat was pushed back on his head, and he was watching her with an expression that was careful and quiet and waiting. Not pitying, not amused, just waiting for her to take the quilt back. She took it. "Thank you," she said automatically. "Some mud on this corner," he said, gesturing toward the trailing edge. "Nothing that won't wash." He said it the way you'd mention that a fence post was leaning. As a fact, relevant but not dire. Not a consolation, just an assessment. "I know," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't move away immediately either, just stood for a moment with his hands loose at his sides. And in that moment, the laughter around them had quieted, because a crowd always quiets when someone fails to participate in the joke. "That border," he said then, and she tensed because she expected the word that usually followed, "is uneven, is too dark, is too bold." But what he said was, "That's the best part of the whole thing, holds everything else in." He said it simply, without particular feeling, as if he was just reporting what he saw. Then he touched the brim of his hat, briefly, and walked on. Hazel stood on the boardwalk with the muddy quilt in her arms and watched him go. He didn't look back. Around her, the street returned to its ordinary business. The laughter had stopped. Somewhere behind her, she was aware of Millicent Harper standing in the doorway of the Mercantile, watching, with an expression Hazel didn't turn around to read. She looked down at the quilt. The mud had caught the corner where the navy border met the deep burgundy of the outer squares. He was right. It would wash. The stitching was intact. The border was straight. That's the best part of the whole thing. Holds everything else in. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he'd stopped when no one else had. Or why the thing he'd said about her quilt was the most accurate thing anyone had said about her work in years, delivered with no investment in her reaction and no particular desire for credit. She folded the quilt over her arm and walked to the wagon. She told herself it was nothing. A stranger's good manners. A coincidence of timing. She was not entirely sure she believed that, and the not believing sat with her all the way home, quiet and uninvited, like the first of something she hadn't asked for and hadn't decided what to do with yet. His name, she learned 3 days later when he came through on his cattle drive and stopped at the Mercer Ranch asking about water for his horses, was Rowan Cade. She almost didn't open the door. She heard the knock and looked through the small side window and saw a man she didn't know standing at her door in the early afternoon, and her hand stayed on the latch for a full 10 seconds while she calculated. Single woman, alone on a ranch, stranger at the door. But there were cattle behind him, a small herd of maybe 40 head moving slowly down the access road toward the creek, and a boy, couldn't have been more than 16, managing the back of the group with a long stick and the focused expression of someone still learning the work. The presence of the cattle and the boy didn't make the man safe, necessarily, but it made him legible. This was a working man, mid-drive, looking for something practical. She opened the door. When she saw who it was, she didn't say anything for a moment. He recognized her at approximately the same moment she recognized him, and something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the beginning shape of one, the corners of his mouth shifting slightly. "Creek's at the east side," she said before he could speak. "Down past the willow stand. Your cattle can water there." "Appreciate it," he said. There was a pause. The cattle moved behind him, and the boy called out something to a steer that had decided to investigate the fence line. "You got them through the pass in good order," Hazel said. She didn't know why she said it. She'd looked at his cattle out of habit. She'd been raised around cattle, and they looked well, which meant something about the man driving them. "We had one bad day early on," he said. "Nothing after that." "Where are you driving them to?" "Corville. Buyer there's been waiting on them since April." She nodded. Corville was 2 days south, assuming the weather held. "The quilt," he said then. "Is it all right? After the mud?" She looked at him. "It washed clean," she said. "Good." Another pause. "What you said about it," she said. "The border." He waited. "Most people said the colors were too loud, or the squares weren't even." She said it flatly, not fishing for a different response, just stating the record. "Were the squares uneven?" "No." He nodded, unsurprised. "Then they were wrong." Simple as that. Not they were being cruel or don't let them bother you. Just, the squares were not uneven. Therefore, the claim was incorrect. The facts of the matter, stated without editorializing. She almost said something that would have been more than she intended, but she caught it in time. "Your boy can fill the water cans at the trough there," she said instead, gesturing toward the side of the barn, "if he needs it." "Thank you," Rowan said. "We'll be out of your way within the hour." He was. She watched from inside the house, through the window, while his cattle drank and his boy filled the cans, and Rowan himself walked the perimeter of her fence line with the automatic attention of someone who has spent his life noticing whether things are sound or failing. He paused once at the section nearest the creek where 2 posts were beginning to list, and he stood there for a moment with his hands on his belt, just looking. And then he moved on. He didn't say anything about the posts. He didn't offer to fix them or comment on them or make her feel their deterioration. But 2 days later, when Hazel walked that section of fence herself, she found the posts had been straightened and reset, tamped solid, with no note and no request for acknowledgement. Just the work, done. She stood at the fence for a long time. She was not a woman given to sentimentality. She'd had to unlearn sentimentality early because it made the disappointment sharper, and there had been a lot of disappointments. She'd built her life on the principle that expectations were a form of debt you'd eventually have to pay, and that the safest approach was to expect nothing from anyone and be pleasantly surprised when people behaved decently. This, the straightened posts, the matter-of-fact words about her quilt, the boots that had appeared in the dirt without waiting to be asked. This was the kind of thing that a person with no defenses would read as meaningful. She had defenses. She had spent years building them. She told herself the posts were just a practical thing. A man who knew fence lines had seen a problem and fixed it because it was the kind of thing you fixed. She went back to the house and sat down at her work table and picked up the quilt she was halfway through, a commission from the Dobbins family for a wedding gift. She stitched until the light went, and then a while after, by lamplight, and she did not think about straightened fence posts. She tried hard not to think about them. The following week, she finished the Dobbins commission and took it into town and collected her payment and was walking back to the wagon when she nearly walked directly into Clara Osgood coming out of the post office. "I'm glad I caught you," Clara said, which suggested she'd been watching for Hazel. "I want to talk to you about the circle." "I'm not sure I'm going back," Hazel said. Claire's expression did something complicated. "I know. I wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. You don't need to apologize for other people." "I'm not apologizing for them. I'm apologizing for not saying more at the time." Clara looked at her steadily. "Your quilt was beautiful, Hazel. Anyone who looked at it honestly could see that, and Millicent knew it, which is why she said what she said." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean?" "Millicent doesn't waste time on things that aren't a threat." Clara said it almost gently. "She only bothers with people who have something she doesn't." Hazel considered this. "I don't have anything Millicent Harper could possibly want." "You've got skill she can't buy," Clara said. And you don't spend it trying to impress her. She paused. In Millicent's world, that makes you difficult. They stood for a moment in the weak afternoon sun. The cattle drover, Clara said. The one who stopped when you fell. Hazel looked at her. What about him? Geraldine says he stopped at your place. He needed water for his cattle. Of course he did. Clara's tone was neutral, which meant she was being careful. His name's Rowan Cade. He drives cattle through here 2 or 3 times a year. I don't know him well, but he has a solid enough reputation. I don't know him at all, Hazel said. No, Clara agreed. I just thought, since he came up, she hadn't asked about him. Clara had volunteered it, which meant the town was already connecting them, which meant that the single gesture of having her quilt picked up and returned had been noted and catalogued and was being interpreted. She thought, of course it was. Everything in Red Hollow was noted and catalogued and interpreted. That was the nature of small towns. They ran on information the way machines ran on fuel, and a woman alone on a ranch was always an interesting subject. Thank you, Clara, she said, for what you said about the quilt. Clara nodded. She walked to the wagon and drove home. That night, she laid the quilt out on her work table and looked at it for a long time. The border, the strong, clean navy that ran along all 4 sides, holding everything else inside it. She'd been uncertain about it when she first cut the fabric, worried it was too dark, too definitive, but something had told her it was right, that the whole thing needed containing, that the soft golds and the deep burgundies and the complicated middle needed something firm at the edge to let them be what they were without spilling out into nothing. That's the best part of the whole thing, holds everything else in. She thought about a man who fixed fence posts without asking, about the particular quality of attention he gave things, unhurried, accurate, without performance. About the way he'd looked at her quilt and said the one true thing about it, simply like it was a fact that anyone could verify if they cared to look. She thought about Red Hollow, about Millicent Harper and Geraldine Foss and the women in the back room who'd been given permission to find fault and had found it eagerly, about Clara, who'd apologized and meant it, about the way a town decided what a person was and then looked at that person through that decision forever after, and how exhausting it was to be decided about, and how much she'd spent her whole life accommodating that decision by making herself quiet and small and out of the way. She was 25 years old, and she had built a life out of endurance. She was good at it. She'd had to be. But sometimes in the evenings, when the ranch was quiet and the work was done, and there was nothing left to do but sit with herself, she wondered what it might feel like to build something else. Not just endure, but build. Not just survive the town's opinion of her, but make something so undeniably true that the opinion became irrelevant. She looked at the quilt. The border held everything in. She thought, maybe that's enough to start with. She folded the quilt and put it away and went to bed. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north again, and it found the gaps in the walls, fewer of them now after her years of patching, and made its cold, familiar sound. Not a threatening sound, just the world reminding her it was there, and that she was in it, and that morning was coming whether she was ready or not. She had always been ready for mornings. That was something no one in Red Hollow had ever managed to take from her. Rowan Cade came back 6 weeks later. Hazel was in the yard when she heard the cattle before she saw them. That particular low sound a herd makes when it's moving easy, no distress in it, just the steady rhythm of animals that know where they're going. She set down the fence tool she'd been using and straightened up and watched the road. 40 head, roughly, same as before. The boy was there again, working the back with more confidence than the first time. He'd learned something in the weeks between. You could see it in how he moved. And Rowan was at the front, riding a bay horse she hadn't seen before, a solid animal with a calm way of carrying itself. He pulled up at the gate and touched his hat. "Creek still open?" he asked. "It's still there," she said. He nodded toward the east, and the boy understood and started the cattle moving without being told. Rowan dismounted and tied the bay to the fence post, the one he'd reset, she noticed, though she kept that observation to herself. "I brought something," he said, and reached behind him to a bundle tied to the saddle. He worked the knot loose and held it out. It was fabric, a collection of it, wrapped in oilcloth. Maybe a dozen pieces of varying sizes, some rough canvas, some softer cloth in faded colors, one piece of dark green wool that looked like it had started life as a military coat. She looked at it without taking it immediately. Picked them up from settlements along the upper route, he said. People clearing out old things. Thought you might... He paused, not finishing the sentence, as if he'd only now considered that she might not want someone else deciding what her work needed. Where'd the green wool come from? She asked. Old homestead north of the pass. Family had cleared out 3 years back. The house was standing empty, and the blanket was on a line like they'd just forgotten it. Took it down before winter could finish it off. She took the bundle. The wool was thick and still good. The color faded but even, no moth damage she could see. I'll use this, she said. I figured you might. There was a brief silence in which neither of them felt the particular pressure to fill it that most people did in silences like that. Hazel had always been uncomfortable with the social expectation that quiet meant awkwardness. Most of the meaningful moments in her life had happened in quiet, and she'd learned to trust it rather than fight it. Rowan, she was beginning to understand, had learned the same thing, or had never needed to learn it at all. You want coffee? She asked. Your boy looks like he could use something. Rowan glanced toward the creek, where the cattle were drinking, and the boy was walking the bank with his hands in his pockets. He'd appreciate it. She went inside and started the fire under the pot, and a few minutes later both of them were sitting on the porch steps while the boy, his name was Denny, she learned, 16 years old, and from a family in Corville that had 5 other children and not enough work for all of them, drank his coffee with both hands wrapped around the cup like it was something he'd been waiting for. You drive this route regular? She asked Rowan. Spring and fall, mostly. Sometimes a third run in summer if there's a buyer. Where do you winter? He took a moment with the question. Different places. I don't have a particular one. She nodded. She understood the answer without needing to push at it. Some men moved because they liked to. Some moved because they'd been somewhere they needed to leave. She didn't ask which kind he was, and he didn't offer it, and that was fine. Denny asked if he could look at the barn, and Hazel said yes, and then it was just the two of them on the steps with their coffee and the sound of the cattle at the creek. The women in town, Rowan said after a while. Do they always go at you like that? She looked at him. You heard what happened at the sewing circle? Bits and pieces. He shrugged. Small town. Things get around. That's the other thing small towns run on, she said. Other people's trouble. It wasn't your trouble. No, she said. But it gets told like it is. He was quiet for a moment. The woman. The one in the center chair. She the one who runs things? Millicent Harper. Hazel said the name the way you'd describe weather. A fact, not a feeling. She's run the social machinery of Red Hollow since before I was born. Or close enough. What's her problem with you? It was a direct question, said without any particular heat, just curiosity. The kind of question that would have felt intrusive from almost anyone else but landed differently from him. I'm not sure it's about me specifically, Hazel said. I think it's about what I represent. A woman alone who isn't looking for rescue. It disrupts the order of things. She paused. She needs everyone to have a place, and my place doesn't fit neatly into anything she's organized. Rowan considered this. Sounds exhausting. For her. Hazel almost smiled. I hope so. He came through 4 more times over the following months, always with cattle and always stopping at the creek. And somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd visit, the pretense that he was only there for the water became thin enough that neither of them bothered maintaining it. He brought fabric each time, scraps and remnants from settlements along his routes, things people had left behind or given away or didn't know what to do with. A piece of curtain lace so delicate it seemed impossible it had survived the frontier. A square of red flannel with a name embroidered in one corner. Someone's child, Hazel thought, or someone's memory of one. A length of faded blue chambray that had been a man's shirt once, worn to silk softness at the elbows. She used all of it. She spread the pieces on her work table in the evenings and moved them around the way you'd arrange a puzzle you didn't have a picture for, finding the logic that lived inside the cloth. The relationships between colors and textures that weren't obvious until you laid them next to each other and stepped back. Rowan would sometimes sit at the table with her on the nights he stayed late enough and watch the process. He didn't offer opinions unless she asked, which she occasionally did, not for reassurance, but because she found that his eye for practical matters translated into something useful in color and composition. He noticed structural things, whether the border weight was sufficient, whether a particular square was pulling the eye away from the center in a way that felt unresolved. "You've got a good eye for this," she told him once, "for someone who doesn't sew." "I notice when things are balanced," he said, "and when they're not. It's the same principle everywhere." Fences and quilts. Fences and quilts. He looked at the table, at the half-assembled work. "What's this one for?" "A family over on the Ridgeway. They lost their oldest son last winter." He was quiet. "I'm using cloth from things of his," she said. "His mother brought me a bag of it, his work shirts mostly, and a pair of trousers that were worn through at the knees." She smoothed one of the shirt squares flat. She couldn't throw them away, but she didn't know what to do with them sitting in a drawer. Rowan had his hands on the table, relaxed, but something had changed in his face. Not much. He was a man who didn't wear his interior readily, but something. "That's good work," he said, and then more quietly, "What she's giving you. The cloth. That takes something." "It does," Hazel said. She didn't ask him anything more about it. Later, she would understand that he'd been talking about more than the Ridgeway mother's grief. The problem started in October. She became aware of it gradually, the way you become aware of a leak. Not the moment it starts, but the moment the damage becomes undeniable. She'd go into town for supplies and feel it in the way people looked at her. Not the usual cool indifference she'd grown up navigating. Something more specific, more aimed. Clara came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual enough that Hazel knew before opening the door that something was wrong. "There are things being said," Clara said without preamble, once she was inside and her coat was off. "What kind of things?" Clara sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands in the way of a person preparing to say something she'd rather not. "That the drover is taking advantage of you." Hazel waited for the rest of it. "That you don't know better, that he's using your hospitality, and you're reading it wrong because you don't have experience." Claire's jaw was tight. "That a woman like you doesn't have the standing to bring a man like that into her sphere without knowing what she's inviting." "A woman like me," Hazel said. "Those are their words, not mine." "Who's saying it?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Geraldine. But Geraldine doesn't say things without permission." "Millicent, then." It was always Millicent, working through the people who owed her their position in the social arrangement of Red Hollow. "What's the actual concern?" Hazel asked. "Not the stated one, the real one." Clara looked at her. "You've been different since spring, less accommodating." "I haven't done anything." "You haven't backed down," Clara said. "You came back to the circle after what happened at the gathering, and you brought your work, and you sat through everything Millicent said, and when you left you held your head the same height it had been when you walked in." She paused. For Millicent, that's a provocation. Hazel thought about this. It shouldn't have been. There was nothing in holding your head straight that was aggressive, nothing that demanded anything from anyone. But she understood what Clara was telling her. Millicent's world was organized around the principle that certain people were meant to be smaller, and when those people refused to perform their smallness, it broke something in the order that Millicent had spent decades building. "She's going to make this worse," Clara said. "I don't know exactly how, but I know she's been talking to people I wouldn't expect her to talk to. The land office clerk, one of the men from the county recorder's building." That landed differently. That wasn't gossip. That was something else. "The land office," Hazel said. "I don't know what she's looking for," Clara said quickly. "I don't want to alarm you without something solid to give you. I just thought you should know." After Clara left, Hazel stood at the window for a long time. The light was going flat in the way it did in October, the warmth out of it, the sky a uniform gray that pressed down on the landscape. The land. Her father had left her the ranch in a will that had been filed properly and witnessed by two men who were both dead now. She'd had no reason to question it, no cause to think there was anything in the papers that could be used against her. The Mercer land had been Thomas Mercer's, and then it had been hers, and the county recorder had the deed with her name on it. She pulled her father's box out from under the bed. He'd kept his papers in a tin box that had belonged to his own father, old, slightly dented, with a latch that stuck in cold weather. She hadn't opened it in 2 years, maybe longer. She'd looked through it after he died to find the will, and then she'd closed it and put it away because there was too much of him in there, and she'd needed some time before she could be in a room with all of it. She opened it now. The will was there, and the land deed, and a stack of letters she didn't read, And beneath all of that, something she hadn't noticed 2 years ago, or had noticed and not understood the significance of. A folded document, water-stained along one edge, in handwriting she didn't recognize. She unfolded it. It was a boundary agreement. Old, 40 years at least, from the look of the paper, between Thomas Mercer's father and a man named Whitfield over the eastern property line. The Whitfield name didn't mean anything to her immediately, but the terms of the agreement did, because the eastern line it described was different, by about a quarter mile, from the line that appeared on the modern survey attached to her deed. Her hand was steady as she set the paper down. A boundary dispute, 40 years old, between two men who were both dead. Incomplete on its face. The agreement referenced a follow-up survey that she could find no record of. Unresolved, which meant that on paper at least, there was a question about where the Mercer land ended. Not a large question. Not one that would hold up if you looked at 40 years of tax records and payments and continuous use. But large enough, in the hands of someone who wanted to make trouble, to file an inquiry with the county recorder, to put a question mark next to a woman's claim to her own land. She sat at the table for a long time. Visit, she told Rowan when he came through 2 weeks later. She hadn't intended to. She'd intended to handle it herself, quietly and methodically, the way she handled everything. But he was sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee, and she set the boundary agreement in front of him without thinking about it first. He read it. He was a slow, careful reader. She'd noticed that before, the kind of man who didn't skim. "Where's the follow-up survey referenced here?" he asked. "I can't find it. Could be in the county records." "That's what I think. Or it might not exist." He set the paper down and looked at her. "Who's pushing on this?" "I think Millicent Harper found the gap and is using it." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because you've been coming here, and she's decided it means something, and she wants me destabilized before whatever she thinks is happening between us can—" She stopped herself. Rowan held her gaze without moving. "Before it can continue," she finished. There was a silence that had more shape to it than the usual ones. "Is something happening?" he asked. Not challenging, just asking, with the same directness he brought to fence posts and quilt borders. She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was. There were things she'd been carefully not thinking about, and this question was standing right in front of all of them. "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded once. "That's honest. I try to be." He picked up the paper again. "You need to find that survey or prove it was never filed, and you need to pull your tax records, every year back to when your father took ownership. Continuous payment and use overrides an old boundary dispute. Any decent legal mind will say so." "I know that. I know you know that," he said. "I'm just saying it out loud so it's not only in your head." She appreciated that. The difference between someone telling you what you already knew because they thought you didn't know it, and someone saying it out loud because thoughts needed to be spoken to stay solid. She knew the difference, and he was doing the second thing. "I'll go to the county office next week," she said. "You want company?" She thought about that. The part of her that had built its life on self-sufficiency said no automatically. The part of her that had been alone for a long time said something more complicated. "No," she said, "but thank you." He nodded, accepting that without pushing on it. She gathered the papers back together and put them in order, the way her father had taught her. Oldest first, current deed on top. "Rowan," she said. He looked up. "The fabric you brought last time, the piece of dark wool, the one with the fray at one end." He was still watching her. "Where did that one come from?" A pause. Something moved in his face, small and careful. "My wife's coat," he said. "She passed 3 years ago." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without the performance of grief or the performance of having moved past grief. Just a fact he'd decided to tell her. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd always hated that reflex. The apology people offered in place of anything real. "I thought so," she said. He looked at her. "How?" "You handled it differently than the other pieces. You didn't hand it to me with the rest. You set it on the table separately." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I didn't know if you'd be able to use it." "I can," she said, "if you want me to." He looked at the table, at the piece of dark wool sitting in the corner. "I brought it here," he said finally. "I think I must have wanted you to." She picked it up. She ran her thumb along the frayed edge, feeling the quality of the weave underneath the age of it. The wool was fine, dense, dark as good earth after rain. "I'll put it somewhere central," she said, "where it can hold some weight." He didn't answer. But when she looked up, his expression had changed in a way that was hard to describe. Not relief, exactly. Not release. Something quieter than that. The face of a man who had been carrying a thing carefully for a long time and had just been offered a place to set it down. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north again. The cattle shifted in the yard, and Denny called out once, "Nothing wrong, just the ordinary management of a herd at rest." The boundary dispute was still there, in the papers on the table. Millicent Harper was still there, in the machinery of the town, turning her levers. The gossip was still circulating, the names being said in the back of the mercantile and over fences and wherever small-town damage got done. But inside this kitchen, with the coffee going cold and the fabric on the table and the papers that would need sorting and the work that was always waiting, something had shifted that Hazel couldn't entirely measure yet. She was not the kind of woman who named things before she was sure of them, but she was sure of this. She was no longer simply enduring. She was building something, not only in the quilt on the frame behind her, but in the choices she was making about what she would defend and what she would refuse to surrender. She wasn't going to become smaller for Millicent Harper's comfort. She wasn't going to make herself invisible so the town could feel settled. And if that meant the next few weeks were going to be difficult, then she would handle difficult the way she'd always handled it, methodically, without drama, one step after another, until there was no more ground to give. She had survived Red Hollow's opinion of her for 25 years. She figured she could survive it a while longer. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of a room where important things happened slowly. Hazel had been there twice before in her life. Once with her father, when she was 12, and once after he died to file the transfer of the deed. Both times she'd sat in the wooden chair across from the clerk's desk and felt the weight of the place. The way that certain buildings made you aware of how small a single person was against the accumulated record of everything that had come before. This time she sat in the same chair and spread her papers on the desk, and did not feel small. She'd spent the 2 weeks since Rowan's visit going through her father's tin box with the kind of attention she usually reserved for her most difficult needlework. Slow, deliberate, nothing skipped. She'd found the tax records going back 18 years, to the year Thomas Mercer had taken over the ranch from his own father. She'd found letters referencing the eastern boundary that confirmed what she already knew, that her grandfather had settled the Whitfield dispute informally, with a handshake and a shared fence line, and that both families had operated on those terms for decades without incident. And she'd found, tucked inside the lining of the tin box itself, folded so small it might have been there for years without anyone noticing, a single sheet of paper that made everything else irrelevant. It was a signed release. The Whitfield heir, a son apparently, who had inherited briefly before selling and moving east, had signed away any claim to the boundary dispute 32 years ago, witnessed by a notary whose seal was still clear despite the age of the paper. Thomas Mercer had kept it, and apparently forgotten to file it, or perhaps had never seen the need to, because in those days a man's word and a signed paper in a tin box were considered roughly equivalent in terms of actual weight. They were not equivalent in terms of legal weight, but the paper existed, which was the thing that mattered. The clerk, a young man named Purcell, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, examined the release for a long time. He looked at the notary seal. He looked at the date. He looked at Hazel. "This resolves the inquiry," he said. "I know it does," Hazel said. "I'd like that noted in the record." He wrote something in the ledger. She watched him write it and asked him to read it back, and he did. And she made him correct one word that was ambiguous. And when she left the county building, she had a copy of the notation in her hand and the release itself back in her folder. The air outside tasted better than it had going in. She stood on the steps of the county building for a moment and let herself feel it. Not triumph, exactly, because it hadn't been a battle she'd expected to have to fight, and winning a thing you shouldn't have had to fight for was more exhausting than satisfying. But solid. She felt solid, like something that had been uncertain was now weight-bearing. She thought about Millicent Harper, discovering that the inquiry had been resolved. She thought about the land office clerk who had apparently helped file it, doing so on what he now knew was fabricated grounds. She thought about the weeks of gossip, and the slow social campaign that had been run against her, and she felt something that she recognized after a moment as anger, clean and specific and not particularly interested in revenge, just in accuracy, in being correctly understood. She drove back to Red Hollow and went directly to the sewing circle. She had not been in 2 months. She'd stayed away deliberately, partly because the wound from the quilt incident had needed time, and partly because going back felt like accommodation, like proving Millicent right, that Hazel needed the circle more than the circle needed her. But she walked in that Thursday afternoon with her mending bag over her shoulder and took her usual chair and said good afternoon to the room, and the room said good afternoon back with varying degrees of uncertainty. Millicent's face was a careful thing. She was too experienced a social operator to let her reaction show immediately, so what Hazel got was a controlled pleasantness that was more revealing than open surprise would have been. "Hazel," Millicent said, "we weren't expecting you." "I know," Hazel said, and pulled out her mending. The circle settled back into its work. The conversation moved around Hazel the way water moved around a stone, finding its way past her, but she was present, and that presence shifted the room whether anyone wanted it to or not. Clara, across the circle, caught her eye and gave her a look that said several things at once, the main one being good. About 40 minutes in, Millicent said, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "I understand there was some question about your property line resolved recently." The room didn't go quiet. It continued its surface business, but it listened. Hazel could feel the listening. "There was," Hazel said, "an old document that needed filing. It's been filed now." She kept her eyes on the mending in her lap. "Everything's in order." "I'm glad to hear it," Millicent said. "These things can become complicated." "They can," Hazel said, "when someone makes them complicated." The pause that followed that sentence was brief, and Hazel didn't look up to fill it. Millicent changed subjects. The circle moved on. But something had happened in that exchange, and everyone in the room had felt it. And when the meeting ended and Hazel was gathering her things, 3 women she'd barely spoken to before stopped to say goodbye in a way that suggested they'd noticed. Clara waited until the others were gone. "That was well done," she said quietly. "I didn't do anything," Hazel said. "You came back," Clara said, "and you said what you said without raising your voice. That's doing something." She paused. "Millicent won't leave it there." "I know." Hazel pulled the strap of her bag over her shoulder. "But I'm not leaving it there either." She was already building the quilt in her mind before she consciously decided to make it. It started the evening after the sewing circle, when she was at her work table with the pieces Rowan had brought and the fabric from her own collection, moving things around in the way she did when she was working through a problem. She'd learned over the years that her hands sometimes knew things her conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet, and that the best thing to do when that happened was to keep moving the cloth and let the understanding arrive. What arrived that evening, slowly and then with increasing certainty, was the shape of something large. Not a commission piece, not a utilitarian work, something she was making for the specific purpose of saying something. Not in words, because words were Millicent's territory, and Hazel would lose any argument conducted in words, where cleverness and social standing counted for more than truth. But in cloth, in the irreducible fact of a made thing. She started with the dark wool from Rowan's wife's coat, because that was the piece she was most uncertain how to use, and she knew from experience that the difficult piece had to go in first. She cut it carefully, following the grain, and laid it near the center of the table. It was heavy, that wool, and it anchored everything around it. She started placing other pieces in relation to it, working outward from that dark center the way a conversation worked outward from the thing you were really trying to say. She used the red flannel with the embroidered name. She used the curtain lace so fragile it took 3 backing layers to give it enough structure to hold. She used cloth from her mother's apron and cloth from her own worn-out dress from years back, and she used a piece of brown canvas that had been a feed sack once, and a square of the indigo she'd bought off the trader 2 winters ago, and a strip of butter yellow from a curtain that had hung in the Ridgway house before the family lost their son. She didn't plan the design. She let the pieces tell her where they needed to be, the way she always did, and after 3 nights of working late, the center of the quilt had a logic to it that felt right. Not symmetric, not pretty in any conventional sense, but true. Each piece carried something. Each one had been somewhere, had kept someone warm or covered a window or wrapped a body against the cold. She sent a note to Clara asking if she could come by. Clara arrived the next afternoon, took one look at the work table, and sat down without being asked. "Who are you making this for?" Clara said. "Red Hollow," Hazel said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" "The harvest gathering's in 3 weeks." The harvest gathering was the largest annual event in Red Hollow. Not a formal dance, not a ceremony, just the town coming together at the end of the working season, in the way frontier towns sometimes did, out of the recognition that winter was coming and that people needed to see each other before it did. It was held in the open space behind the feed store, and virtually everyone in town came, which meant virtually everyone Millicent Harper had ever cultivated as an ally or a subject would be there. "You're going to show the quilt at the gathering," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to bring it," Hazel said. "What happens after that will depend on what happens." Clara looked at the work on the table. She reached out and touched the edge of the dark wool near the center. "Is this?" "Yes," Hazel said. Clara pulled her hand back slowly. "Does he know you're using it this way?" "He gave it to me to use." "That's not the same thing." Hazel looked at her. "I know. I'll talk to him when he comes through." She said it with more certainty than she felt. The conversation she'd had with Rowan about his wife's coat had lasted about 3 minutes and had not gone very deep. She knew he'd given her the fabric because something in him wanted it to become something else, but she didn't know what he expected from that, or whether he'd understood that she might use it publicly. That was a different thing from using it at all. She kept working. The quilt took 3 more weeks, which meant she was finishing the border in the 2 days before the gathering, working by lamplight with her fingers going rough and her back aching from bending over the frame. She'd had to unsew one section of the lower right corner twice because the tension was wrong, and she'd lost half a day to a mistake in the border alignment that she caught late and fixed at the cost of a night's sleep. When it was done, she laid it out on the floor of her front room, the only space large enough, and stood back and looked at it. It was not the prettiest quilt she'd ever made. It was too complicated for that, too many competing textures and weights, the colors too varied to be conventionally harmonious. But it was the most honest thing she'd ever made. Every piece had a story, and the stories were woven together in a way that felt, to her, like something true about how lives worked. Not clean, not simple, full of mismatched edges and unexpected adjacencies, but holding together. The border ran in the dark navy she'd chosen for her first quilt, the one that had ended up in the dirt on the main street of Red Hollow. Strong and even, holding everything inside it. She folded it very carefully and packed it into the largest canvas bag she owned. Rowan came through the day before the gathering, which was either coincidence or not, and Hazel didn't ask. She told him about the county recorder and the release she'd found, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Your father kept that paper for 30 years without filing it." "He probably never thought he'd need to," she said. "People don't," Rowan said, "until they do." Then she told him about the gathering. She told him what she'd been building and what she intended to do with it, and she told him about the centerpiece, the dark wool, and what it was, and she watched his face while she said it. He was looking at the window, not at her, and his jaw was set in the particular way of a man who is being careful with himself. "I should have told you before I went this far with it," she said. "If it's wrong, I'll take it out. I can rework the center." He was quiet for a long time. "My wife's name was Dara," he said. Hazel said nothing. She waited. "She was sick for about a year before she died. Not dramatically. She just got smaller and slower, and one morning she didn't wake up, and that was it." He said it in the flat tone of someone who has told a version of this story enough times that the words have been worn smooth. "I was driving cattle when it happened. I came back to an empty house." "I'm sorry," Hazel said. She meant it the way she hadn't meant it the other times she'd thought about saying it. He nodded once. "The coat was hanging by the door. I couldn't leave it there when I sold the house, but I didn't know what to do with it either." He finally looked at her. "I brought it to you because I trusted you to know what to do with it. That hasn't changed." "I want to use it where people can see it," she said, "if that matters." He thought about that. She wasn't the kind of person who'd want to stay hidden, he said. "If that helps?" It did. The harvest gathering started in the late afternoon, when the sun was still warm enough that people stood in the open space without coats and ran into the evening when it got cold, and the fires were lit and people moved closer to them. There were tables with food, and somewhere on the far side a man with a fiddle who was playing badly but enthusiastically. Hazel arrived later than most, which was intentional. She came with Clara, who had insisted, and she carried the quilt folded over her arms. She'd thought about how to do this. She wasn't going to stand on something and make a speech. That was Millicent's approach, the performance of authority. She was just going to unfold it where people could see it, let the thing do its own work. She found a spot near the center of the gathering where 2 fence rails formed a natural frame, and she and Clara lifted the quilt and spread it across the rails and stepped back. It was larger than most people expected. It caught the light from the fires on the eastern side and the remaining sun from the west, and the colors shifted and deepened as the light moved over them. People nearby turned to look. The turning spread outward in the way of any sudden focal point, not quickly, but steadily. Hazel stood next to it with her hands at her sides and said nothing. The first person to stop and look, really look, close up, was a woman named Ruth Halden, who'd lost her husband 2 years back and whose grief had made her quiet and peripheral at town events ever since. She stopped in front of the quilt, and her eyes moved across it and then stopped at a particular square, the red flannel with the embroidered name, and something changed in her face. "That's," Ruth said. She didn't finish the sentence. "The Connolly family donated it," Hazel said quietly, "after their boy." Ruth pressed her mouth together. She nodded once and kept looking. Other people came. The man who ran the feed store identified the canvas from his own stock, a bolt he'd sold off years ago to a woman who'd needed to recover a roof. A girl of about 12 grabbed her mother's sleeve and pointed to the curtain lace because it had come from the house where her grandmother had lived before she died. 2 old men on the far side of the gathering came over and stood in front of the quilt for a full minute without saying anything, and Hazel could see one of them thinking through something that he didn't say out loud. Millicent was across the gathering space. Hazel could see her, in the corner of her vision, watching with the expression of a person calculating a situation. She did not come closer. Not yet. What happened instead was that people started talking to each other, not about the quilt exactly, but about what was in it, which was different. The cloth was a door, and walking through the door meant talking about the thing the cloth had been before it was cloth, which meant talking about the people who'd worn it, and the places it had been, and the years it had survived. That was not nothing, in a town that rarely talked about the things that mattered. Hazel was standing slightly apart from the crowd when she became aware of Rowan beside her. He'd come up quietly, the way he moved, and he was looking at the quilt from the same angle she was. "She'd have liked this," he said. "Dara." "How do you know?" "She was the kind of person who liked things that had been somewhere," he said. "New things bored her." They stood next to each other for a moment. "People keep finding themselves in it," Hazel said. "That's what you made it for." "I made it because I was angry," she said honestly, "and because I had something to say and no language for it except this." Rowan looked at her sideways. "It's a good language." Across the gathering, Millicent had begun moving toward them. Hazel watched her come, not with dread exactly, but with attention. Millicent moved with the grace of a woman who had never needed to rush anywhere because things waited for her, and she crossed the space with her usual authority, stopping a few feet away from the quilt. She looked at it for what felt like a long time. "It's technically accomplished," she said finally. "Thank you," Hazel said. Millicent's eyes moved across the center of the quilt, where the dark wool sat heavy and grounding among the other pieces. "Where did you get the wool?" Rowan answered before Hazel could. "It was my wife's," he said, plainly, without drama, in a voice that carried just far enough for the people nearby to hear. Millicent looked at him. Then she looked at Hazel. And whatever she'd come over here to say, whatever the next maneuver was in the campaign she'd been running, she recalculated it in the space of 3 seconds and said nothing. She looked at the quilt once more, and for a moment, just a moment, something in her face moved that was not calculation and not contempt. Something that looked, in spite of everything, like recognition. She said, "My sister made quilts." Hazel looked at her. "Before she passed," Millicent said, "we used to fight about them. She'd cut up perfectly good fabric for them, and I thought it was wasteful." The controlled expression was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, very slightly. I have 3 of them in a trunk. She didn't say anything else. She turned and walked back toward the tables and the fire, and the crowd that had formed around the quilt let her go and then closed back into itself. Clara appeared at Hazel's shoulder. Did Millicent Harper just tell you something personal? I think she did, Hazel said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Well, the world is strange. The fiddle player had gotten marginally better, or the crowd had gotten used to him, because people were beginning to move in the direction of music the way they did when an evening was going well. The fires were higher now, and the air had the particular quality of autumn nights in open spaces, cold overhead, warm near the flame, the smoke carrying the smell of good burning wood. Hazel looked at her quilt, spread across the fence rails, catching the firelight. People were still stopping. A woman she didn't recognize was tracing the border with one finger, following the dark navy line around the perimeter, and her expression had the inward quality of someone thinking about something that hadn't occurred to them in a long time. She thought about what Rowan had said. That's what you made it for. She'd made it in anger and in grief and in the stubborn refusal to be made invisible, and somewhere in the making it had become something else, something she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely take credit for. That was what happened sometimes when you worked long enough with honest material. The thing you made outgrew your reasons for making it. She didn't know what came next with Millicent Harper, or what the town would do with what it had felt tonight, or whether the change she thought she saw in the gathering space was real, or just firelight making things look different than they were. But she knew that the dark wool was at the center of the quilt, and it was holding everything else in its weight, and that Rowan had said his wife's name out loud in front of a crowd for the first time in 3 years, and that she herself was standing in the middle of Red Hollow's largest annual gathering without looking for an exit. That was not a small thing. She had a long drive home ahead of her, and the fence post needed checking before winter, and there were 3 commissions waiting on her work table. Tomorrow was going to be the same as any other day, in most of the ways that mattered. But something had been said tonight that couldn't be unsaid, in a language that had no words in it, and she thought that it was going to mean something. Not immediately, not in any way she could map out in advance, but eventually, in the slow way that honest things meant something when you gave them time. She stood in the firelight and let herself have that. The morning after the harvest gathering, Hazel woke to find a bag on her porch. She almost stepped on it coming out for the early chores, a flour sack, tied at the top with a piece of twine, set just to the left of the door, where she'd have seen it as soon as it was light enough. She stood in the cold with her coat half buttoned and looked at it for a moment before crouching down to open it. Fabric. A bundle of it, folded with the particular care of someone who doesn't usually fold things carefully, but understood that this required it. A man's blue shirt, the collar worn through. A child's pinafore in yellow cotton, faded but clean. A strip of brown wool that had been a scarf once, the fringe still intact at both ends. There was no note. She brought it inside and set it on the table and stood looking at it while the coffee heated. She didn't know who'd left it, and she didn't know if they meant it as an apology or a request or something in between. What she knew was that someone had stood on her porch before first light, in the cold, and placed something there that mattered to them. She thought about that while she worked through the morning. By midday, when she went into town for flour and lamp oil, she had a partial answer. The woman behind the counter at the dry goods, Vera Stanhope, who was 50 and blunt, and had never been particularly friendly to Hazel, though not unfriendly either, more like neutral in the way that a fence post was neutral, looked up when Hazel came in and said, without preamble, "My mother made that pinafore." Hazel looked at her. "The yellow one," Vera said. "I left it this morning. I didn't know how to ask in person." She set her hands flat on the counter. "The quilt last night. My daughter saw herself in it," she said. "In the lace piece. She was 6 when my mother died, and she doesn't remember much. But she saw that lace and she just—" Vera stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't expected it to do, and she waited for it to settle. "I want her to have something from that. If you can make something." "I can make something," Hazel said. Vera nodded. She went back to her work and Hazel collected her flour and oil, and neither of them made anything larger out of it than what it was. But it was not nothing. That was the beginning. Over the following 2 weeks, more pieces came. Not all at once, not as a flood, because life didn't work that way. And the people of Red Hollow were not the kind to rush toward emotional exposure any more than anyone else was. but steadily, in the particular way that things moved in small towns once a threshold had been crossed. Ruth Halden came to the ranch in person, which Hazel knew was not easy for her. Ruth had been inside her own grief for 2 years, and the world outside it had gotten strange and unfamiliar, and the walk up Hazel's porch steps had cost her something visible. She brought her husband's work vest. Good wool, well made, the buttons still all there, and she sat at Hazel's kitchen table and talked for an hour about a man named Gerald, who had been stubborn and occasionally wrong and had made the best cornbread in the county, and had died of a fever in March 2 years back, leaving Ruth in a house that still smelled like him for months. I didn't want to wash his clothes, Ruth said, but I couldn't keep them unwashed forever. She looked at the vest on the table. I thought if they became something else, it'd be easier. It might be, Hazel said. It might not, but they'll be somewhere real instead of in a drawer. Ruth looked at her. You're not going to tell me it'll all be fine. No, Hazel said. Good, Ruth said. I'm tired of people telling me it'll be fine. They sat together for a while after that, not talking, which was the most honest thing two people could do in that situation, and when Ruth left, she walked down the porch steps with a slightly different quality to her movement. Not lighter, exactly, but more deliberate. Like someone who had set something down and was choosing what to pick up next. The families came one by one over the following days. A father whose daughter had left for the East and hadn't written in 3 years, bringing a dress she'd outgrown before she left. 2 brothers who hadn't spoken in 6 years over a land dispute coming together to bring their mother's tablecloth, which neither of them had wanted to own, but neither had wanted to give up either. A young woman who'd had a baby that didn't survive its first winter, bringing the small blanket she'd made during the pregnancy, and couldn't look at anymore but couldn't burn. Each time Hazel listened more than she spoke. She'd never thought of herself as that kind of person, the kind people came to with their weight. But she understood, in the way she understood cloth, that she wasn't the point. The cloth was the point. She was just the person who knew what to do with it. She worked every night until her hands stiffened, sorting and cutting and beginning to plan the next quilt, which was going to be larger than the harvest quilt and more complex. She didn't sleep enough. She didn't particularly mind. What? Clara came midway through the second week, and she came with news rather than fabric. Millicent wants to talk to you, she said. Hazel was at the work table, and she kept her hands moving. About what? She didn't say specifically. Clara sat down across from her. She sent word through me, which means she's asking rather than telling. That's new. It is. Clara watched her sort through a pile of donated squares. She's lost 3 committee positions in the last 2 weeks, the Harvest Guild and the Lending Society and the Women's Auxiliary. Hazel looked up. People have been reconsidering things, Clara said carefully. Some of the women who were in her corner have stepped back. Not dramatically, just not showing up, not agreeing with things automatically the way they used to. Because of the gathering? Because of everything, Clara said. The gathering was the most visible part, but people had already been watching. What she did with the land records, that got around, Hazel. The clerk talked. People don't love a woman who would go to those lengths over nothing. Hazel thought about this. She hadn't told anyone about the boundary dispute beyond Clara and Rowan. She hadn't needed to. Millicent's campaign had involved enough people in its machinery that when it unraveled, those people had seen the unraveling from the inside. She wants to meet here? Hazel asked. She suggested the mercantile back room. Neutral ground, she said. Neutral ground. That was interesting. The phrasing of it implied a conflict to be ended, not a social courtesy. Millicent was negotiating. Hazel considered it for 2 days before agreeing. She was not interested in a confrontation, and she was not interested in a performance of reconciliation that would let Millicent reset the board and start again from a better position. What she was interested in, what she decided she was going to go looking for, was something real. If Millicent Harper was going to talk to her, then Hazel was going to make sure they talked about the actual things. They met on a Wednesday morning when the mercantile was quiet, and the back room held only the 2 of them. Millicent was already seated when Hazel arrived, which said something about the care she'd taken with this, because Millicent always arrived after other people. She looked, in that room without an audience, smaller than she did in the sewing circle. Not physically. She was still a well-presented woman who had always understood how to inhabit a room, but something had come down in her that Hazel hadn't expected to see. "Thank you for coming," Millicent said. Hazel sat down across from her. "Clara said you wanted to talk." Millicent looked at her hands on the table. They were the hands of a woman who was older than she usually let herself appear, fine-boned but thick at the knuckle. A scar along the left thumb she'd likely had for decades. Working hands underneath everything. "I owe you an apology," Millicent said. Hazel waited. "What I did with the property records was wrong." She said it like someone reciting something they've rehearsed, not because they don't mean it, but because the only way to get through it was to have the words ready. "I wanted to destabilize your position before things with the Cade man went further. I thought I was protecting the town from something disruptive." She paused. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you decided what was disruptive," Hazel said. "Yes." Millicent's jaw moved. "It does. And you decided that I was disruptive. Me specifically. Not anything I'd done, just what you were," Millicent said. "Or what I decided you were." She looked up. "I know that's worse." Hazel looked at her steadily. "What changed?" Millicent was quiet for a moment. "The quilt," she said. "My sister's quilts are in a trunk, and I haven't looked at them in 11 years. I didn't think I was the kind of person who had feelings about that." Something crossed her face, not quite pain, but the echo of it. "I'm not telling you this as an excuse. I'm telling you because you asked what changed, and that's the honest answer." Hazel thought about the woman who had told her at 17 that she wasn't what men looked for. She thought about 2 years of sitting at the edge of that sewing circle, managing her own visibility, working twice as hard as anyone at the project pieces so there'd be no legitimate complaint. She thought about the mud on the navy border of her first quilt, and the laughter, and the years of carrying herself carefully through a town that had decided what she was. She said, "You can't give those years back." "No," Millicent said. "I can't. And I'm not going to tell you it's fine. I'm not asking you to." Hazel looked at the table between them. "What are you asking?" Millicent was quiet for a moment. "I have 3 of my sister's quilts in a trunk. She made them in the last 2 years of her life when she was too sick to do much else, and they're the best things she ever made, and no one has ever seen them except me." She met Hazel's eyes. "I'd like someone to see them. Someone who understands what they are." That was not what Hazel had expected. She thought about what it meant that Millicent Harper, who had controlled the social world of Red Hollow for 30 years through the careful management of other people's perception of her, was sitting in a back room asking a woman she'd tried to harm to look at something private and precious. It wasn't redemption. Hazel didn't believe in clean redemptions. They didn't hold, and they asked too much of the wronged person and too little of the one who'd done wrong. But it was something. A beginning, maybe, of something honest. "Bring them to the ranch," Hazel said. "Not this week, but when you're ready." Millicent nodded. Something in her spine adjusted, like a person who has been holding a position for a very long time and just discovered they're allowed to put it down. They didn't say much else. There wasn't much else that needed saying, not that day. They were 2 women in a small room, and the space between them was full of things that would take time and disagreement and a certain amount of discomfort to work through, and neither of them was naive enough to think that a single conversation resolved it. But they had the conversation. That was something. D. Rowan had been gone for 6 weeks when Hazel received a letter. It was short. He wasn't a man who used more words than the matter required. And it was written in the same careful hand she'd seen when he'd made a note once about a load count. He was in Dunmore, 3 days east, settling what he called unfinished business. Property he'd inherited from his wife's family that he'd been paying tax on from a distance without dealing with directly, because dealing with it directly meant going back to a place he hadn't been able to face. He'd gone. The business was taking longer than he'd expected. He wrote, "The house is sold. The land will take another 2 weeks to clear. I'm well. I think about the quilt." She read it twice and then set it on the work table and sat with it. 6 weeks was not a long absence for a man who drove cattle for a living. She'd known him through absences. That was the shape of what they were to each other, presence and absence, the creek and the cattle and the fabric he brought from distant places. She was not a woman who had built her life around waiting for a man, and she was not going to start. But she noticed the absence in a way she wouldn't have a year ago. Not painfully. She had too much work for pain to find much purchase. But in the way you notice a gap in a fence line. The air moved differently through it. She wrote back. She told him about the women coming to the ranch with their fabric. She told him about Millicent. She told him that Denny, his boy, had apparently told people in Corville that Rowan worked for the best quilt maker west of the ridge, which she'd heard secondhand and which had made her laugh for the first time in a week. She wrote, "The quilt is going to the community hall. Claire's arranged it. People want it somewhere everyone can see it, and I think they're right. Some things belong to the room they're in." She didn't write anything else that she was thinking. There were things she was thinking that didn't belong in a letter. The community hall was a low building on the north end of town, used for meetings and the occasional visiting speaker and the storage of things the town owned collectively. Claire had spoken to the man who managed it, a tired, pragmatic person named Holt, who mostly wanted someone else to make the decisions. And he'd agreed readily because agreeing was easier than the alternative. They hung the quilt on the long wall opposite the door, which meant it was the first thing you saw when you walked in. Claire had found 2 long iron hooks already set in the wall from some previous display, and the quilt's border, the dark navy, strong and even, sat level between them the way it was meant to sit. Hazel stood across the room and looked at it for a while after they'd hung it. It looked different on the wall than it had on the fence rails at the gathering. More permanent. Less like an event and more like a fact. The dark wool near the center caught the morning light from the east window and held it differently than the lighter pieces did. Heavy, steady, the way certain things stayed heavy and steady no matter what moved around them. "You should say something," Claire said. There are people coming this afternoon." "I'm not making a speech," Hazel said. "Not a speech. Just be here. Let people see you next to it." Hazel understood the difference. A speech would have been Millicent's approach, the performance of the moment, the management of how it was received. Being present was different. It was just standing in a place you had the right to stand in and letting people decide what they thought about that without stage managing it. She stayed. People came through the afternoon. Not a crowd, just the steady trickle of people who'd heard and were curious, the same way people came to see anything new in a town that didn't get much that was new. Some of them stopped and looked for a long time. Some of them identified their own contributions in the fabric and pointed them out to whoever they'd come with. The 2 brothers who'd brought their mother's tablecloth came together and stood side by side in front of the quilt without speaking, which was the most they'd stood side by side in 6 years. Geraldine Foss came in the late afternoon, which was the last person Hazel expected. She stopped at the door when she saw Hazel, and her expression did several things in quick succession. And then she came in anyway and walked to the quilt and stood in front of it with her arms folded in the particular defensive posture of a person who has not decided yet what they're doing there. Hazel said nothing. She let Geraldine look. After a while, Geraldine said, without looking away from the quilt, "The lace at the top right. Where did that come from?" "A homestead north of the pass. Abandoned." Geraldine was quiet. "My grandmother lived north of the pass before she came to town." She paused. "Before she died." Another pause. "I'm not saying it's hers." "I know," Hazel said. "I'm just saying it looks like something she would have had." Hazel looked at the lace. Delicate, pale, carrying its age and the particular unevenness of the weave. "Some things look like they belong to us even when we can't be sure," she said. Geraldine didn't answer. She looked at the quilt for another minute and then she left, still with her arms folded, and she didn't say anything else. But she'd come, and she'd looked, and she'd said the thing about her grandmother. That was more than nothing. Clara materialized at Hazel's shoulder. "Geraldine Foss just stood in front of your quilt and talked to you." She did. "Last year she told the sewing circle your stitching was inferior." "I know." Hazel watched the door where Geraldine had gone. "People change. Some of them. Enough of them." The letter from Rowan arrived 10 days after she'd sent hers. He was still in Dunmore, a complication with the land transfer, a surveyor's report that needed verification, the particular slowness of legal processes in places that didn't have enough clerks for the work. He'd be another week at least, possibly 2. And then, I've been thinking about destinations. I've spent 11 years knowing where I was going. I'm not sure I know anymore, and I find that I don't mind not knowing as much as I thought I would. She read that sentence 3 times. She understood it the way she understood cloth, not by analyzing it, but by holding it and feeling the weight. She set the letter down and went back to work. The quilt on the community hall wall was drawing people to each other in ways she hadn't anticipated. Women who'd been careful and distant were finding their way to conversations they'd been avoiding. Old arguments were getting aired in the presence of something that reminded people what mattered and what didn't. Hazel heard about this secondhand, mostly through Clara, because she wasn't in the community hall every day and she didn't need to be. The quilt was doing what it was supposed to do without her standing over it. She was in the middle of 3 new commissions now. The one for Vera Stanhope's family, one for the 2 brothers with their mother's tablecloth, and one for Ruth Halden, who had come back a second time with more of her husband's clothing and a clearer sense of what she wanted the finished piece to hold. Each of these commissions was different. Each required her to understand the specific weight of the specific grief or love or history she was working with. It was not easy work, and it was not fast work, and some evenings she sat at the table and her hands didn't want to move, and she made them move anyway. She didn't have anyone to complain about this to. That was one of the facts of her life that she'd grown used to. There was no one at the end of the day to say this was hard to, no one to receive the ordinary difficulties of the work. She'd built her life to run on one person's energy, and mostly it was enough, and sometimes it wasn't. And when it wasn't, she went to bed and got up the next morning and started again. But she was aware in those evenings of the empty chair across the table, the chair that Rowan sat in when he was here, hands on the table, not filling the silence but being in it. She was not a woman who needed someone in that chair. She'd proved that 100 times over, in ways that hadn't been easy to prove. But wanting something and needing it were different, and she was old enough to know the difference, and honest enough to admit to herself, in the quiet of an evening kitchen, that the chair was not just a chair. She folded the day's work, straightened the table, and went to bed. Outside, the first real cold of winter was settling into the ground, and the north wind had the particular edge it got in late November. Not the searching cold of October, but the committed cold of a season that had made up its mind. The fence posts held, the walls held. She had patched them well enough, she had built a life that held. Whatever else was coming, and something was coming, she knew that the way she knew when a quilt needed one more piece to be complete, she would meet it from this place. From this house that was hers, and this work that was hers, and this self she had spent 25 years not quite finishing. The chair across the table was empty. The letter on the work table said, "I don't know where I'm going anymore, and I don't mind." She thought, that makes 2 of us. She thought it without fear, which was new. She let the cold settle and the fire burn down and the night do what nights did, and she slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Rowan came back on a Thursday, which was the day the sewing circle met. Hazel didn't know he was coming. She'd had his last letter for 10 days, brief, practical, saying the land transfer had finally cleared and that he had some decisions to make about what came next. And she'd read it and put it with the others in the tin box that had been her father's and gone back to work. She was not the kind of woman who stood at windows watching roads, and she'd made a point of not becoming that kind of woman even when the temptation was there. She heard the cattle from inside the house, and her hands went still for a moment on the fabric she was cutting, and then she set down the scissors and went to the door. Same herd, roughly, same easy sound of animals that knew where they were going. Denny at the back, taller than she remembered. The boy had grown 2 inches in the months since she'd last seen him, or maybe she just hadn't noticed before. And Rowan at the front, on the bay horse, in the thin December light that made everything look like it was happening slightly further away than it was. He pulled up at the gate and looked at her. She looked back. "Creek's still there," she said. "I figured," he said. He dismounted. Denny took the herd east without being told, which meant Rowan had said something to him in advance, which meant this stop was not incidental. Hazel noted that and said nothing about it. They stood in the yard with the cold air between them and the particular quality of silence that existed between 2 people who had been exchanging letters for 2 months and were now in the same physical space for the first time in a while. Letters were a managed thing. You decided what to put in them. You had time to consider. Standing in a yard was different. Standing in a yard was just 2 people with everything they hadn't written down. "How was Dunmore?" she asked. "Done," he said. Everything's settled. The house sold all right? Sold fine. He was holding the bay's reins loosely, and the horse stood patient and still the way well-trained horses did. I stayed longer than I needed to. I kept thinking I was going to feel something when I left, some kind of resolution. He paused. I didn't, particularly. I just left. That's how it goes sometimes, Hazel said. Yeah. He looked at her. I thought about that. Whether the resolution was supposed to come from the place, or whether I'd been carrying it wrong all along, expecting the geography to do work that wasn't the geography's job. She thought about her father's tin box, and the release she'd found in the lining, and the way the land had stayed land regardless of what she felt about it. Places don't resolve things, she said. They just hold them for a while. He nodded slowly. The quilt's in the community hall. Since mid-November. I heard. In Dunmore. He looked faintly surprised by that, like the distance the news had traveled was still catching up to him. A woman there had been to Red Hollow for business. She mentioned it. Hazel thought about that. The quilt traveling as a story, the same way people traveled, moving from mouth to mouth through the spaces between towns. She wasn't sure how she felt about that yet. Something between exposed and understood. Come inside, she said. The coffee's on. Book. They sat at the kitchen table the way they'd sat there a dozen times before, with the coffee and the fabric on the table and the work waiting on the frame in the corner, but the room felt different than it had before Dunmore. Not tense, exactly, but awake. Like the air in it was paying attention. Rowan had his hands around the cup, and he was looking at the quilt on the frame, the one for Ruth Halden that was 3/4 done. Ruth's husband's clothing, Hazel said. It's coming together. Slowly. She turned her own cup in her hands. She came back twice to talk while I've been working on it. I think she needs the visits as much as the quilt. Rowan was quiet for a moment. That happened a lot? The talking? More than I expected. She looked at the table. I didn't set out to be the person people came to. It just... She paused, looking for the honest word. People need somewhere to put things. I happen to have a table and a process, and I don't tell them what to feel. He looked at her. That's not a small thing. I know that now. She hadn't always. She'd spent years thinking her value was only in the work itself, the technical quality, the precise stitching, the clean borders. The idea that the listening was part of the work, that sitting with Ruth Halden while she talked about cornbread and stubborn habits and a man who'd been imperfect and irreplaceable. The idea that this was also skill, also labor, also something worth doing, that had come to her slowly and still felt uncertain sometimes. Rowan set his cup down. There was something in his manner that said he'd been carrying a conversation in his head for a while and was deciding how to start it, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who struggled to start things. I've been thinking about the land, he said. She waited. The Dunmore property was the last thing tying me to the route I've been running. I sold it, and now I don't have a reason to go east anymore. He looked at her steadily. I've been sleeping in different towns for 11 years. I know how to do that. I'm good at it. He paused. I'm tired of it. The kitchen was very quiet. There's a parcel on the south side of your property, he said, the 40 acres that runs down to the creek bend. Your father let it go uncultivated. It's too rocky to farm. For crops, yes. For cattle, it's different. He said it carefully, like a man who has thought through the practical case and is presenting it first because the practical case is easier to say. I've got enough from the Dunmore sale to buy the parcel if you'd sell it, and enough to build something basic on the south end. I could run a small herd, tie in with your water rights on the creek. Hazel looked at him. You're talking about buying land. Yes. Next to my land. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north again. The committed December cold that had settled in and wasn't leaving until March. She could hear it finding the edges of the house, testing the patches she'd put in over the years. That's a practical proposal, she said. It is. That's all you want to say about it? He held her gaze. No, he said, but I'm trying to give you something you can refuse if you want to. A parcel sale is a parcel sale. You can say no to the land without saying no to anything else. She thought about the letters. The particular sentence she'd read 3 times. I don't know where I'm going anymore. And I don't mind. She'd understood it then, and she understood it now. It was a man saying that the life he'd organized around motion had stopped making sense, and that something else was pulling at him, and that he hadn't decided yet if he was brave enough to stop moving and let it. "Rowan," she said. He waited. "The land question and the other question are the same question," she said. "You know that. So do I." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at a piece of cloth she was trying to understand. "So say the other thing." He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding it. She could see him taking the measure of it, the way he took the measure of things that mattered before he spoke. "I want to stop leaving," he said. "I want to come back here and have it mean something permanent, not a promise I'm not sure I can keep, because I've never done this and I don't know how I'll be at it." The words came out with the particular texture of honesty that had been pressure tested before delivery. "But I want to try, with you, if you want that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 17 years old and a woman telling her she wasn't what men looked for. She thought about 20 years of making herself small and careful and manageable, of reading the room before she entered it, of building walls not out of anger, but out of the sheer exhaustion of being wrong about people enough times to stop expecting different. She thought about the quilt in the dirt, and the boots that stopped, and the fence post that got fixed without a word. She thought about the chair across the table that was empty on the wrong kind of evenings. "I want that," she said. "I'm not going to be easy about it. I've been alone a long time and I have habits." "I know," he said. "And you've been moving a long time and that doesn't just stop." "I know that too. We're probably going to be bad at this for a while." "Probably," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly. "I've been bad at worse things." She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "The south parcel," she said. "I'll sell it at a fair price. Not a favor price. Fair." "I'd expect nothing else," he said. Millicent Harper came to the ranch on a Saturday in late December, carrying a wooden crate that she managed with both arms, and the particular expression of someone transporting something irreplaceable and slightly terrified of dropping it. Hazel met her at the gate and took one side of the crate without being asked. They carried it inside together and set it on the kitchen table, and Millicent stood back and looked at it for a moment before opening it. There were 3 quilts inside, folded with the kind of care that meant they'd been handled regularly. Not stored and forgotten, but tended, refolded. The creases shifted so they didn't set permanently into the fabric. The first one Hazel lifted out was small, lap-sized, in blues and greens, pieced in a simple but elegant pattern that said the maker had a good eye, even if she hadn't had years of practice. The stitching was uneven in places, tighter where the maker had been paying attention, and looser where her concentration had slipped, which was honest stitching, the kind that showed the person inside the work. The second was larger, more complex. The colors were bolder, deep reds and golds, the kind of choices that took confidence. The maker's skill had grown between the first and second, visibly, the way it grew when someone worked at something long enough to stop being afraid of it. The third was different from the others. Hazel held it for a long time. It was unfinished. The top was complete, all the squares pieced and joined, but it had never been quilted through. The backing was basted in place, but the actual needlework that held the layers together had never been done. The maker had gotten this far and then, Hazel understood, had not been able to finish. Because finishing meant it was the last one, and the last one was something you put off as long as you could. She looked up at Millicent. Millicent was looking at the unfinished quilt with an expression that had nothing controlled about it. It was the face of a woman who was 60 years old and had been managing her own grief for 11 years by managing everything around her instead, and who had just carried that grief into a room and set it on a table. "She ran out of time," Millicent said. "I know," Hazel said. "I thought about finishing it myself. I don't sew." She said it simply, without apology. Hazel looked at the quilt again. The top was beautiful, the maker's best work, the colors and shapes at the height of whatever she'd been building toward in those 3 quilts. It deserved to be finished. "I could finish it," Hazel said, "if you want." Millicent looked at her. Something moved across her face that Hazel had never seen there before. Not the calculated pleasantness or the controlled authority, but something closer to what Ruth Halden had looked like sitting at this same table talking about cornbread and lost habits. Raw, uncertain, real. "I'd want it done the way she would have done it," Millicent said. "Not better, not more polished, the way she would have done it." "I understand that," Hazel said. Millicent nodded once. She looked at the table, at her sister's 3 quilts laid out in sequence, the small blue one and the bold red one and the unfinished one that was waiting. She was better than me, she said, at most of the things that matter. I spent a long time not wanting to think about that. Hazel didn't say anything. She let that sentence be what it was. I think I made you pay for some of that, Millicent said, because you reminded me of her. The stubborn part. The not caring what anyone thought, even when it would have been easier. Hazel looked at her. I cared, she said. I just couldn't stop. I know. Millicent looked at the quilts. I know that now. They sat together for a while after that, drinking the coffee Hazel made and not talking much. And the afternoon light moved across the work table in the way it did in December. Thin and golden and not lasting long, but honest about itself. No pretense of warmth it didn't have. When Millicent left, she left the quilts. All 3 of them. Spring came, the way it always came to that part of the country. Reluctantly, in fits and starts, one warm week followed by a cold snap that made you think winter had changed its mind. The creek ran high with the melt in the south pasture, which was Rowan's now by deed, held its first small herd of 12 cattle that moved through the new grass with the particular ease of animals that didn't know they were the beginning of something. He'd built a structure on the south end. Not a house, not yet. Just a working shelter, solid and functional. The kind of thing a practical man built when he was figuring out the larger question and needed something to do with his hands in the meantime. He spent his evenings at Hazel's table, which had stopped being remarkable to either of them after about the 3rd week, and had become simply the arrangement of things. They argued sometimes. Hazel had a way of closing conversations before Rowan thought they were finished, shutting a door on something that still needed air, and Rowan had a habit of letting things sit too long when a direct question would have cleared them faster, which was its own kind of avoidance. They were figuring each other out in the way adults figure each other out. Not smoothly, not without friction, but honestly. One evening in April, they were both at the work table, Hazel on the commission pieces, Rowan going over a set of survey maps for the south parcel. And she looked up and said, without particular introduction, I finished your wife's quilt. He looked up from the maps. The one with her coat as the center. I added the last border last week. She nodded toward the frame in the corner. It's done. He stood and went to the frame. She watched him look at it. He was still for a long time, the way he was still when something required it. Not the stillness of avoidance, but of full attention. The quilt was finished. The dark wool at the center, and the pieces she'd built around it, and the border. Not the navy she'd used for her own quilts, but a deep forest green she'd chosen because something in the remaining fabric of the coat had that undertone, a color that had been there all along waiting to be seen. It's good, he said. Quiet. She'd know her coat, Hazel said. If she could see it. He nodded, still looking at it. She'd know what it cost you to put it together right. He turned. You don't have to give this to me. You could put it in the hall. It belongs to you, Hazel said. He shook his head slightly. It belongs to whoever needs it most to have it. He looked at her. Where does it belong? She thought about that, the question of where things belonged, which was really the question of what they were for. Some things were made to be kept. Some were made to be given. Some were made to hang on a wall in a community hall so that people walking through a door in the morning would see something that reminded them what mattered. Here, she said. For now. He came back to the table. He picked up the survey maps and then set them back down and looked at her instead. I fixed the north fence section this morning, he said. The posts were going again. I know, she said. I saw. You didn't say anything. I figured you'd say something when you wanted to. He looked at her for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved the way it sometimes did. Not quite a smile, but the shape one took before it decided to commit. You're the stubbornest person I've ever met, he said. I know that too, she said. Outside, the spring wind came through the yard and lifted something light from the fence line. A piece of cloth she'd hung out to dry that morning, one corner pulling free and snapping in the air for a moment before settling back. The cattle on the south pasture moved in the slow, deliberate way of animals content with where they were. The community hall still had the harvest quilt on its long wall, and people still stopped to look at it, and some of them brought new pieces of fabric and new weight and new grief that needed somewhere to go. And the circle that had once been Millicent Harper's closed circle had opened itself up over the winter in the way that things opened when you stopped managing who was allowed inside. Hazel still sat at the edge of the group. That hadn't changed. She was not a woman who needed to be at the center of things, but the edge felt different now. It felt like a choice rather than a consequence. She had spent her whole life being told, directly and otherwise, that she was the piece that didn't quite fit. Too plain, too solitary, too stubborn, too much herself in a world that wanted its women smaller and more accommodating. She had believed it sometimes, in the hours before dawn when the ranch was quiet, and the cold found the walls, and it was just her and the unfinished work, and the chair across the table. She understood now what she'd been doing wrong with that story. She'd accepted the frame. She'd let the town's definition of fitting in become the measure by which she judged herself. And by that measure, she would always come up short, because the measure had been designed without her in mind. The quilt taught her the truer thing. The border wasn't the broken piece. The border wasn't the part that didn't fit. The border was the part that held everything else in place. The strong, steady edge that let the complicated center be as complicated as it needed to be. Without the border, the whole thing fell apart. The beauty in the middle required the containment at the edge. She had been the border all along. She just hadn't known to call it that. There was no clean ending to any of this. No morning she woke up and found the town transformed. No moment where she and Rowan looked at each other and understood everything. Life on that ranch was work, and work was work. And people were complicated, and Millicent Harper still sometimes said things that landed wrong, and Rowan still sometimes stayed too quiet for too long. And there were commissions that went badly and fabric that didn't cooperate, and weeks when nothing seemed to come together the way it was supposed to. But in the evenings, when the light was going, and the fire was good, and the work was spread across the table between them, something in the room felt true. Not perfect, never that, but true. And when Rowan closed the ranch gate at the end of those evenings and came back inside, he had the specific quality of a man who was not preparing for the next departure. He was just coming in out of the cold. For a woman who had spent a long time learning how to need nothing, that was the bravest thing she had ever let herself have. Not the absence of loss. She still carried what she'd lost, and so did he. Not the end of difficulty. There was more ahead, as there was always more ahead. Just this. A man who stayed, a table full of work that mattered, and a town that was slowly, imperfectly, honestly learning to see what it had always had in plain sight. A border holds everything together. It doesn't ask to be the center. It just does what it was made to do, quietly and without ceasing, and everything inside it is the better for it. That was enough. It had always been enough. Hazel had just needed 25 years, a quilt in the mud, and a man who fixed fence posts without being asked to finally understand that.